I studied art from the age of 11, right? My mom is here tonight. I want to say a huge thank you to my mother, Freddie. Hey, take a stand. This is one of the rare opportunities to actually have her in the room. So, a big thank you. But Mama had me in art school when I was, we were like 11 years old. Me and my twin brother, who's here as well, we were looking at art at such a crucial age and like learning how to make drawings and learning how to coax things into being as images and looking at some of the great museums in Los Angeles. You don't think about great art when you think about Southern California, but there's a couple cool institutions. And we would see, you know, landed gentry in powdered wigs and lapdogs and pearls. And I think a big part of me was just sort of, what is this about? What is this, the pomp and circumstance that surrounded so many of these quote-unquote powerful people in those paintings? And I think what I really wanted to do was to sort of scratch the itch of wanting to feel just as important as an institution that surrounded those bodies. There weren't any bodies that happened to look like my own, but I knew that in some way this obsession with painting, this obsession with image making might avail itself to me if I were lucky or just hung on long enough.
I mean, the revelation is perhaps about gesture, about recognizing that when you deal with people who have, you know, lower status, who have less power, nevertheless they can embody themselves exactly with that gestural pride and self-assertion that you might see in those paintings. Did you make that kind of connection, or you know, or am I making that up?
Well, I mean, I just don't see them as having lower status. I don't see them as embodying.
Put that in quote marks. Just
okay,
to, you know.
All right. I was like, I was with you for a second.
Well, do you know?
No, but look,
Yeah.
seriously, I get where you're going, and I think that what I really want to do is to come to painting with a sense of empathy.
Yeah.
Because not everyone makes work that looks like this, because it's not everyone's experience that leads them to draw certain conclusions. And the conclusions that I draw with my work have to do with the desire to connect, rather than a desire to create a type of bombast for its own sake. Sure, these paintings are designed to be highly decorative and sugary sweet to the point that they draw you in. And it's that sugar pill that allows you to see what's even further within that narrative. So much of what I try to do in my work is to really look at the language of body. This, back in the day, was considered to be the ways that someone in a this is, I believe, a direct reference from Frans Hals, this sort of Flemish notion of dignity and grace. But then how do we then transport black women's hairstyles from the 21st century into something that sort of becomes this morass, this Medusa-like coil that becomes its own stand-in for power today? I think that all of that stuff is fluid. The language of respect that you referred to before is fluid. It requires a level of empathy that allows you to nod and to say yes and amen to the people who happen to look like you.
So look, you know, we're at the BFI, and I want to ask this question. Yeah, how do you move from working as a painter, or why did you feel it was necessary to expand your practice into filmmaking? Well,
no one has time to pose for paintings anymore. Like, painting from life is out. But what we can do is to create photo shoots, and I paint from these photos. And over the years, I've actually been having film crews there with me while I've been finding people in the streets and painting in the studio. And I think it's really cool to be able to sort of extend that practice, because so much of it is more than just the picture on the wall, but rather the experience at large. Going into Jamaica or into Jerusalem or into the Congo and having people either embrace you or reject you is a really powerful thing. And I was tired of just being the sole witness to that. And so I think there's really something really powerful about seeing what process is, so that it's not just the painting, but rather who this person was as they were minding their own business, trying to get to work that day. And all of a sudden now we see them on one of the great museums of the world, on the walls, in that moment. It really fixes it as a transformational act. to be able to use the language of both painting, sculpture, increasingly objects like stained glass. All of these are tools to amplify actuality. Painting of anything is the way that light bounces up against a structure or against a surface. Stained glass itself is the presence of pure light made form. There's an incredible opportunity here to be able to participate in a language, to participate in an act of celebration of life, of form, in both high and low ways. You know, we can go from talking about the unknown to Kanye West to Barack Obama or what have you. This is basically a tool. It becomes a tool that can both celebrate an individual, but it also can point to certain absences.
I mean, there's a shift though, isn't there, from World Stage Jamaica, the second film we saw, which is a documentary, to Narrenschiff, which is, if you want, visual poetry. Is there a shift for you in terms of artistic practice there, in terms of filmmaking, in terms of the ideas and the methodology you bring to that? How did that occur for you?
Narrenschiff is an experiment. Every new stab at something unique is. You know, when I first started sculpture, stained glass, I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but in the end, I figured it out. Narrenschiff is a project that is coming after so many other versions of image making. You know, one of the things that you have to realize is that painting and film have so much to do with each other. The way that we edit an image or a human body in a frame has so much to do with film. It's received. We never cut the body at an elbow. We never cut the body at a knee. We always do it 3/4, either above and below the knee or above and below the elbow in film. Why is that? Well, it becomes the language of painting. So filmmakers receive the language of painting, and that editing technique then flows into filmmaking. And even without knowing the history, quite naturally, we just sort of receive this vocabulary in a very innocent way. I wanted to obviate some of those moves. I wanted to obviate that space that exists between painting and filmic space. I wanted to obviate that tissue that exists between visual and literary poetry. And so there's a very strong reason why the language of representation and resistance, such as the psychological writings of Foucault and Fanon, start to come into the picture with Narrenschiff. Some of the observations of Pascal start to sort of heighten the beginning of the film. All of these things really kind of like point to this tissue, in my opinion, that connects visual and moving pictures to two-dimensional pictures. One thing that you can definitely say about all of these bodies of work is that they're radical acts of transformation and translation, trying to find a bridge between one language and the other, whether it be the language of dignity in Western European painting and the Black American street, or the language of dignity between the male subject in a painting and Black women as families in large paintings such as Naomi and her daughters. There's a constant striving to make a legible connection in the age of art that fuels difficulty as an aesthetic component. Most of the work that I was taught to admire at Yale, and most of the work that I was taught to admire within conceptual and minimal fields of thought, had more to do with denying accessibility than it did with connection. And I think that we can weaponize some of those tools around communication, both aesthetically and conceptually, towards things that are broader than just self-aggrandizement as the person who's in possession of the magnum opus, the confession in his cave, and who emerges every 5 years. I think rather it's much more important to try to create new fields of providence where we can start to recognize perhaps something a little bit different, like, whoa, that's not quite exactly the way I would see it or do it, but boy, is it textured in a way that resonates.
So as an experiment, what did you discover in the process then of making this film? What did you discover that you didn't know?
I think that it wouldn't be, I think it would be a mistake to look for a clean slate. I think the bigger truth has more to do with some of those small little breakthroughs with regards to light, for example.
Well, tell me,
when you look at the show, and we don't have images of the current exhibition at Stephen Friedman Gallery, which opens tomorrow night, those are all marine paintings. I've never done a show of marine paintings. I've never done a show which concentrates on the black body in relationship to big bodies of water. It's about madness, it's about migration, it's about America, it's about a society willing to self-destruct rather than to see itself in a different light. It's about Brexit, strangely. I think you as viewers are going to have to draw your own conclusions about how you respond to these paintings. Insofar as an artist has his ideas around what an object is about, for every viewer there's a different point of view as to how to interpret and extrapolate meaning from those objects.
I mean, let's talk about it in a bit more detail. So the Narrenschiff, this is popular kind of Renaissance story about a ship of fools, literally a ship full of foolish people who, as I understand it, they kind of set sail, everyone wants to be the captain, no one knows how to pilot the ship. It's a kind of, it's an allegory. It's popular medieval or Renaissance allegory, but why did you recover that story for now? What does it say to you about our world right now?
The Narrenschiff is real. During the 13th century, there were ships that were gathered in every major port of call in Europe, predominantly Western Europe. We're thinking about France, Germany, Spain. And they would literally have families and communities turn out who they called their fools to be rounded up and placed in ships. These ships would then set sail and be delivered to sites of sanitarium where they would lock people up. Some estimates were that as large as 30% of the population of Europe was involved in this trade of madness. Even within communities of Jews, there were, during the Middle Ages, sub-communities of Jewish fools who were then turned out as outsiders within an outsider group. It's not an imagined thing. This level of an ability for a society to point to others is, I think, a very key and central metaphor, one that I didn't want to beat over the head by getting too literal about the historical sense. But I do think that it's important to point to certain key research, such as what was done with madness and civilization, Foucault points to. But my entry point for the title of the show, In Search of the Miraculous, comes from Bastian Otter, who in the 1960s, as an American conceptualist, starts to think about himself as at once hyper-rational and hyper-romantic. And so this young artist creates a boat, and he decides to go sailing from the coast of New York back to Scotland. And he dies on the trip. It's his last performance art object, and for someone so rational, it's such a tragic and romantic way to go. That type of metaphor for a way of being in the world seems to be a perfect stand-in for where I would argue American political society is. Perfectly poised to sort of throw itself over into something deeply attractive and deeply full of folly. This new body of work represents something a lot more fluid and poetic than the earlier works, and I think that you'd be cautioned not to draw simple lines of confusion or narrative conclusion on this video or on the paintings, but I think there's a lot there to take in.
So the timing is not accidental. We can say that.
I think the timing is certainly not accidental in the sense that every artist responds to the society that he's given.
I mean, there is a line I wanted to pull out from there. So, so the film is narrated by C.C.H. Pounder, The Wire fame, great actor, pairs some passages from Foucault, Madness and Civilization, and from Fanon, Wretched to the Earth. There's a line, one of the lines that stands out for me, is a line where it talks about colonialism forces, it's a Fanon line, colonialism forces the colonized to constantly ask the question, who am I in reality? And for me, there's a fascinating shift that takes place in the pairing of passages, because we start off with some notion of madness, perhaps as an interior condition. We move to this as a social condition.
That's right.
As a recognition that actually this can be an imposed situation. I mean, can you speak about that at all?
That's a really great point, and there's a key moment about interiority and exteriority with regards to identity and madness. And I really love the way that, in terms of picturing the body within water, you can at once think about getting somewhere and being mired. And so there's these moments where the water feels as though there's people moving through space. And then there's moments where water becomes sheer spectacle, almost as though they were a type of abstraction. And I really loved, and perhaps I was being a bit decadent, sort of lingering on the water as much as I did, but there was this place where I wanted the water to sort of verge on the rapturous, where the body sort of disappears into light. So much of the language of the religious has to do with the ways in which the body disappears into light and becomes the presence of God, the presence of fullness. And the absence of that fullness is what I would argue that madness is about, that sort of constant desire to be on terra firma, the desire to sort of arrive at the new port of calls. It could be easily a metaphor for migration. And so many people look at that film and they think about some of the images that we constantly see televisualized today around black bodies moving through bodies of water. And of course that resonates. And of course I was quite aware of that too. And again, I'm responding to the society that I'm given, but I think I'm engaging both the conversation around identity, madness, and nationhood as much as I am around the conversation surrounding migration.
Well, I mean, there's contemporary migration. There's obviously, in terms of black history, African American history, there's obviously, a history of migration that goes back hundreds of years. And the returns always, or often anyway, to the sea as a pivotal point of departure, of becoming, almost of unwelcome becoming. And how aware are you not just of the kind of present tense of refugee and migration and forced movement, but also this longer history, this longer, relationship to the sea, to the Middle Passage, to the Black Atlantic, all of these things?
Well, I'm as aware as I tried to be. I think my abiding interest with the sea is a much more personal one. I'm a crazy fisherman. I fish everywhere, all over the world. And I've noticed that in certain parts of the world, black people look at me like I'm crazy. And there's parts of, I would say, Cameroon or Nigeria where it's just, gallivanting out in the open sea. It's just not done. Whereas in Senegal, there's like a tradition of brave seafarers who go out and fish, and Djaboujen is part of the sort of national cuisine. So there's just a different relationship with Mami Wata, who's the sort of malevolent presence within the ocean. The Africans, independent of a colonial power, had their own ideas around what the sea was. Independent of the transatlantic slave trade, there were very Africanist notions about what the promise of the sea was. And I think that there's some really cool contemporary artists who are working within that. I remember doing a portrait of Wangechi Mutu from one of my last exhibitions, and being really wowed at the fact that she herself pictured herself as Mami Wata, who has a strange resonance with Yemaya as well, within the Yoruba pantheon of female water deities. At any rate, I don't want to get too far into specifics about any one culture in water. I think that in regards to this particular project, I was looking at the water as being a safe place, but also being menacing as hell. So how do you create a film where the water feels sort of luxuriant and beautiful, but at the same time something that could draw you into darkness? That for me was the call to arms. And so circularity was an important part of it, trying to find key frames that you come back to. The track, trying to create a musical sense in which circularity of form starts to come into play. And then, of course, trying to get a voice, a narrative voice. CCH Pounder, who has that sort of voice of God thing going on, she also has a very grounded sense, so that there's this sort of discombobulation, this loss of direction, this vertigo, but there's this abiding presence there with you, and I think that was important as well.
I mean, I guess one of the fascinating things about film is that it's three-dimensional in as much as you have the image, but you also have the sound, and you have movement. You have these other layers that come into play. So you talked about these things, you know, about her narrative, kind of spoken narrative, but also about the use of music in there. You know, I mean, these are, to some extent, these are new for you in a non-documentary context. You're using sound, you're using music. Where did you have to go to for that? What were you thinking? How did you construct and think about the use of sound in this one?
What's interesting is that the cello in this film was performed by one of the models who I found for one of my paintings, who happens to be a cello player. And I invited him to sort of respond to this body of work in a very real way. I love the idea that you can create work that kind of starts to become self-aware. In this room today, there's Ricky Jackson, who happens to be a designer who was, I discovered, one of the more talented designers in New York. And I simply met him as a young, fashionable guy who I thought would be perfect for painting. So he happens to be a twin. I happen to be a twin. I invite him to be a subject in the painting. Years later, I invite him to start styling the models within the paintings as a former model of the paintings, so that in a strange way, the system becomes self-aware. It starts to talk to itself and to have its own internal register. I think that it's oftentimes considered crazy to talk to yourself, but as an artist, we have that pleasure. And within this, we've got a really cool crew of people who I've surrounded myself with for years, people who work with creating amazing, resplendent painting light. Ain Cook, who's been with me for years, Amy Godola, who works with me on the road, creating all of these wonderful opportunities to meet and engage with people. My studio is a work of my ideas and my sensibility, but it's also a group effort. And insofar as I try to take the credit for what comes about in these paintings, so much of it is about being surrounded by amazing people and also being graced by chance in a way that is quite possibly unthinkable in many ways. I studied cooking so that I could satisfy my art habit. I thought maybe I'd be a chef to be able to keep the painting thing going. No one knows if they're going to make it in this field. You don't, if you're a young, bright, thoughtful person, you don't decide all of a sudden, well, let's try this painting thing. What I thought was that this was something that I would do for the love of it, and I'm being graced with the ability to go into the world and ask these impossible questions, to be incredibly wasteful. I remember in many small parts of the world where people look at me and my white assistants and my sound booms and the shoulder-mounted cameras, and they're just like, all of this is about me? You've mobilized all of this so that you can have a moment with me and create a... Whoa, what's the catch? And I guess in the end, it is that radical sense of change and, chance that institutes a sense of change towards one's understanding of art and what's possible. This thing is just like, it's wildly improbable. And the fact that this young man is in this particular painting is wildly improbable. I want my insecurities, I want my anxieties to be the subject matter of the work. I want my own personal history to be the subject matter of the work. I want my confusion surrounding the way that I look at America and the body and blackness and masculinity and sexual desire as all one sort of way of looking at one big confusing morass. It's a mess. And it should be sort of destabilizing because there is no master plan. There's simply one guy who got a chance to do this stuff.
I mean, a number of things that strike me from that. One, you know, can see that potentially, you know, there's something significant that happens when you ask these people to pose. You know, you writ them large on a canvas. But I'm also interested in what this does to you. You know, you've talked about transformation and chance, but also change. I'm interested in the person that you become across this process of making this world stage series, making these films and so on.
Well, it's made me a lot more interesting, I think, than I used to be. I think I would punch myself in the face if I met my earlier self. I think that there was just like this, I got this, I understand it. And the truth is you don't. Like, you will wind up offending and stepping on your own feet and not really getting it, and that's okay. There are moments where you think that you're doing someone a favor by, you know, we pay all the models and we try to create a sense of celebration. But imagine going into some parts. We were in the Congo during national elections, unbeknownst to me, our team. We all end up in prison because the optics are all off. We're walking in with this hubris, thinking that we're doing some good, but you know, a bunch of Americans with cameras and lights and paying their young people on the day of the elections to sort of congregate in a small village. It just like yeah, of course they locked us up. But at the same time, there is a sense in which like you can learn from process, and process will then sort of inform where you move from there. I've been able to meet with other interesting artists who fertilized my way of thinking about myself, and hopefully I've been able to contribute in some way in the other direction. Been able to buy really expensive, color-rich, high-quality paint. I always dreamed of like using pro paint, and it makes a difference. Like there's just something really awesome about being able to go into an art store and buy the canvas that you want, and to think big, and to be able to take those small little kernels that are in your mind and say, you know what, I know what it looks like already, and you just wait, this is going to be something. And to like 3 months later, it is something, right? There's a joy in that that I can't overestimate, and it's bigger than some of the things that most people would point to as being the gifts of having the world look at your work. The bigger gifts have to do with those small little breakthroughs and those moments where you just know in your gut, like I'm onto something. This is true north.
We're going to go to questions from the audience.
There's like, it's really, really uncomfortable as a person of color, as a black man going into Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and trying to have a conversation about my field of interest, but also recognizing that you're stepping into a minefield of histories that you at once have no access to, and as a global citizen, complete uncontested access to. I just know what's right and what feels right and what resonates with me, and there's just so much abuse of the Palestinians and their occupied territories that I can't possibly be sitting here and not speak about what's in my heart. At the same time, my project was about the Ethiopian Jewish community, and so that's a very specific and unique point of view as well, which does not entirely sidestep the question surrounding occupation. In fact, it amplifies it in a very unique and specific way. Now, the cancer isn't from without, but those black and brown people are within. These are your people. This is Operation Moses in the 1970s. This is a new way of thinking about the state of Israel and the state of skin color politics, if you really believe in the country. And so I think that's sort of what was really cool and exciting about being able to get there and to talk about hip-hop in the streets of Israel and to be able to kind of problematize the paintings. If you look at the paintings that came out of the Israel series, you'll see that, sure, there are models from different walks of life and so on, but there's also Hebrew written throughout much of it. Even in the frames up top, there's a line from Rodney King from the 1990s translated into Hebrew, where he's being in that state of dizziness after having been kicked in his brain from the police, and he's simply wondering if it's possible to get along. All of that, I think, is a way of trying to take my own personal experience and to, without too much ego, get to the bottom of what it means to have been there at that particular moment in time. Yeah, no, that's it's a great question. There's a lot of annoying art films, and I'm not going to mention any names. I just want to sort of say that the stuff that really got me going was the stuff that moved a little bit away from aesthetic conventions and more in terms of like character and all right, so like just to give specific names, like Jenny Livingstone, Paris is Burning in the 1980s. There's this sense of like, how do you come to terms with this free radical of like young queer black and Latino culture in like Harlem of the 80s as a white lesbian woman, outsider, again, sort of like tribal difference, but a sense of solidarity and curiosity. Like some of the same stuff that I'm dealing with here going on there. I would say films like Tuki Buki coming out of Senegal during the 1960s, where you're looking at a couple of lovers who are at once in love with themselves and their own resplendent blackness in Africa at that period, but also in love with this notion of France as the savior, and this desire to be at once in a place but apart from it. That sort of splitting the baby thing, I think, is really...
You've also talked about Chris Marker before, I think.
That's true. And I think with Chris, there's a type of voyage that's going on here. Which one are we talking about? Sans Soleil. Sans Soleil, Sunless. Masterpiece of a film, which takes the point of view of, well, you never really see him in the film. What you see is his point of view as he's traveling from Japan. He's traveling through Iceland. He's traveling through Guinea-Bissau. And he's wondering how these black women that he's ogling and having certain feelings about are looking at him. And then he's writing letters to a friend who we never see. And she responds to those letters. And there's this weird sense of like, I know this is effed up, but like I kind of want to engage this, but I don't know the right way to do it. And there's a nakedness there. There's an honesty there that it is never going to be pretty, and he's never going to have all the right answers. And it reminds me of Bastian Otter, again, to go back to Bas and his influence on this project. There was one of the most memorable photographs that he's ever created was an image of him, this middle-aged white man, black and white photograph, large, him crying, eyes not looking at you, tears flowing down his face. And on the bottom of it, it says, I have so much to tell you, but I just don't know how to say it. Right? That sense of complete emasculation in the age of political correctness, social change, racial politics changing. What does that mean for you as an utterer, as a speaker, as an artist? You know, I could be easily criticized for having sympathies for his points of view, but I do. And I think that there's something really magical about the perverse, where you're allowing yourself to go that place, where you're allowing yourself to say the unspoken. You know, you look at a great Kara Walker, where she's allowing a type of rampant moral indirection to populate the work, which gives it its gravity, which gives it its...
To some extent, then, how much are all these portraits of you?
Right. I mean, that's the whole idea. I don't yet paint myself, right? I just don't want to look at that. I think it's much more interesting to collect all of these experiences and consider that to be at large. Well, who's doing the looking, right? I mean, this is one hell of a self-portrait, and so it becomes the contours of your aesthetic sensibility, and also the contours of your path on life's journey. Colonialism, in terms of statecraft, is officially dead, although that can be argued. And in terms of my own personal imagined audience, it doesn't come into the picture. For every artist and for every writer and for whomever, there's an assumed reader, there's an assumed viewer, there's someone else in there with you. I can't imagine it being any other way. It'd be awfully sad. But when I think about the person in there with me, it's not the colonizer who I'm there with. It's actually someone who is, if I were honest with myself, is a lot like me, but just oppositional enough to sort of keep me in my place and sort of steer me in the right direction. I don't want my work to come across as overtly corrective, if that makes any sense. I don't want my work to feel didactic to the sense where it becomes prescriptive. I think there's no oxygen in the room left at that point. I think the ideal audience for my work would be a friend, someone who is learning with me and we're sort of abiding together.
Yeah,
well, I'll attempt to give you a sniff of my secret sauce. Well, I mean, you know, I stand on the shoulders of a long line of artists since the 17th century who have studio assistants, and let's just face it, I'm not painting thousands of flowers. I'm a portraitist, and I concentrate on the human body. And so what really does take a lot of time is painting 1,000 flowers. And I do have a number of studio assistants. It numbers between 3 and 4, depending on if there's something mild going on, to 6 to 8 if there's like a big major show where you really need a lot of little tiny flowers going on. But in terms of every human body that you see in those paintings, that's me, and that's, you know, I'm sort of fast in terms of painting, but some paintings fight you. Some paintings are, they come easy, and the lighting is there, and it's beautiful, and it all comes into place, whereas others, you have to put them on a timeout. And, you know, I used to live and work in the same space, and it drives you crazy, because you're constantly looking at it, and you're judging yourself, and you want to sort of attack it again. I learned very early on that it's good to create a separation between where you live and where you work. And you put paintings on timeout. You just say, all right, we're going to turn you around. And in 3 months, you come back to it, and it's a new problem, and it's fresh again, and you can attack it from a different angle. With the newest body of work, it was a completely new experience in terms of painting backgrounds, because now we're not doing these delicate flower to body things. We're dealing with clouds and oceans and black skin and light and the way that well, there's no images here, but you'll see tomorrow that that was a much more difficult transition as well. I think that'll be something exciting for you to see. Some of the ways that this new way of painting for me has sort of encouraged a different type of narrative in the painting. There's, I would say, about a month to a month and a half to get a figure more or less complete. But you know, some things will take longer than that, especially when you're thinking about a room full of paintings. Like if I'm working on 6 paintings at once for a show, some of them are easier to do than others, and some of them fight, and so I'd love to give you a quick and easy answer about the technical stuff, but you know, it's sort of like that. Well, the time question is one that's really tricky for people of color because, you know, it's kind of dangerous back there. I would stay as close to the present as possible. In terms of the technicalities, this is painting in the 21st century, so we'll go from using digital photography to going in with Photoshop and heightening and diminishing certain colors and features. If a shirt is orange and it needs to be green, then we're going to make it green. There's this weird tension, I'm glad you bring this up, because there's this weird tension between the authentic, in quotations, and the performed in my paintings. And so which is the real story? Which is the real person that you're seeing? Is that really the way he appeared on the street at that day, at that time? And I love that, right? I love the sense in which you never really quite know which one is that. There's this anxiety surrounding authenticity in that moment. In fact, I've gone so far as to, in some shows, if everyone is from, let's say, Nigeria, there will be a couple of people from California. And you never know who they are because there's got to be this sense of like, what is the actual, what is the authentic, what is the real? So much of what I'm concerned with has to do with like deconstructing this to be real calculation. So much of Black American hip-hop culture has to do with a sense of authentic masculinity, realness as being a guard or a shield against so many of the ills that come at you. Is that ever even possible? My suspicion is that it's not, and my suspicion is that it's too heavy a cross to bear. But at the same time, I also try to create a type of painting that engages in some of the same techniques physically as a Caravaggio or a Veneer, all of whom used camera obscura to use projections and to create their images in their work. But they also used burnt sienna underpaintings to create a structure under which you would do top-level glazing to arrive at skin tone. Sorry if I'm getting a little too complicated in terms of the technical stuff, but that's my abiding love for the material act of painting, is to sort of keep some of those features within there.
I think we're almost done. I'm going to be selfish. Basically, do you make much distinction between painting, filmmaking, even some of the other practices you make? Because I asked that as a final question, because I'm interested just in how fluidly you describe your practice, how you describe your practice, not really as a sort of technical act, but as a kind of evocative, performative process. I mean, can you speak on that just for a moment, and then we have to kind of
wrap it up.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I love painting the most, and it's always going to be that way. Everything else is cool. It's additive. It amplifies certain features of painting, but it's a painting conversation. The film for me was one big old textured painting with light, and you can use that logic and expand outwards in a lot of different ways. And I love the idea of the kind of like interaction that happens between what I'm doing with my own work and the community. I'm just super excited that there's a lasso effect where it boomerangs back in, and the same community that I'm responding to is now being affected by that work, and you start to speak to young artists who are then starting to be able to take that baton and create their own conversations surrounding how they respond to art history, the culture, and their own ontology.
Kehinde Wiley, thank you so much. Thank you.